Did you know that ripening Cabernet Sauvignon in a hot climate is not unlike having to defeat an army of Orc Urukai? And how is that, you might ask? Well, first of all, both of them are highly time-sensitive situations, and secondly, both of them require at least a basic understanding of the mathematical concepts of both linear and non-linear optimization. Let me explain. When seeking to defeat an army of Orc Urukai, you need to plot passing time against a number of factors to find that maximum benefit window where your chances of victory are at their greatest. But that would be factor one, you need access to the maximum level of defender forces morale, which usually happens during the day. Two, you need to find the time where there is the minimum access to visibility for the attacking orcs, which happens at sunrise when the sun shines directly into their eyes. Thirdly, you need to have maximum access for the defenders to Gandalf-led support forces who can attack the orcs from behind. As I said, in order to have victory, you need all three of these things to coincide. So the situation is very similar when it comes to ripening Cabernet Sauvignon in a hot climate. In fact, defeating orcs is a cakewalk compared to ripening Cabernet. When you're trying to harvest the optimum Cabernet grapes in a hot climate, you don't need three things to coincide. You need four, possibly five elements, all to come into perfect balance at the same time. First of all, you need maximum phenolic or tannin ripeness in the skins and the seeds of Cabernet Sauvignon, which takes a lot of energy from the sun. Secondly, you need moderate, not high, access to potential alcohol, which is sugar levels in the grapes. Thirdly, you need access to maximum natural acidity. And the trouble with this is it declines over time. You can feel the tension building already. Fourthly, you need access to the maximum number of potential flavor, or the building blocks that will be used to create volatile aromas and flavors during that fermentation process. Again, this takes time. And fifthly, depending on your tolerance for it, you need the grapes to have the minimum level of methoxypyrazines left in the grapes. Now, given that methoxypyrazines tail off with acid, but you want acid and you don't want methoxypyrazine, and you do want flavor volatiles to develop over time, but you don't want too much potential alcohol, which is in sugar in the grape, you can see how I choose to smash Orcs over Cabernet any day. Now, the reason that we're talking about the almost impossible mission to ripen Cabernet in a hot climate in a way that is actually delicious to drink is because today's hand drink solar wine of the day is the Arendsig A9 Blok Cabernet Sauvignon, which comes from the wine district of Robertson. Now, the district of Robertson is not only comprehensively continental, at least compared to the rest of the South African winelands, but because it was also the bed of an ancient ocean in a previous chapter in Earth's history, it also has some fairly crazy limestone-rich shale soils, which will become important later on. In fact, according to the supremely geeky winemaker who made this wine, Lourens van Rensburg, it's not uncommon to find trace fossils out in the vineyards. But Han, how can you guarantee that he's geeky?
What do you know, scuzzbucket? How can you be sure?
You're a douche.
Well, let's start by taking a look at his labels. I'm not sure that many design agencies or consultants would stand by what we see on these particular labels. But it needs to be noted here that Lourens is not trying to communicate epic Sigma Riz with his fancy design. Instead, what he's trying to do with all the details on the label is communicate enological and viticultural diligence. First of all, on his labels, he mentions the crazy semi-arid climate in which his vineyards are planted. He mentions the ridiculously low rainfall of about 250 mils per annum. The Swartland gets between 400 and 700 mils per vintage, and they are considered a dry vintage. So that really shows us what we're dealing with here. The next thing he mentions is a particularly high diurnal range of 15 degrees Celsius. This diurnal range is incredibly important in widening that maximum benefit window that we discussed at the start. And you can really understand the details of it more in another video where I've expressed this at length, and I will leave a link to that video in the text alongside this. Thirdly, he mentions the fact that his vineyards are almost 80 kilometers from the nearest ocean, which in part explains that incredibly high diurnal range that we mentioned in the previous point. Now, we know that South African winemakers are quick to talk about the cooling effects of the Atlantic Ocean, but that's really only half the story, because oceans, or in fact any large body of water in viticulture, actually act as a moderating effect, which means it does stop things from getting too hot, but it also stops things from getting too cold. So if Lourens's vineyard had been closer to an ocean, then he wouldn't have got those really cold freezing nights, which are super necessary in order to widen that maximum profit window, which we discussed. Again, you can see all that in our videos on diurnal range. Finally, he talks about those limestone-rich soils. Limestone is alkaline in nature. It has a slightly higher pH, and at least anecdotally, it would appear that high pH soils or alkaline soils seem to trigger vines into producing sap and eventually fruit that has a lower pH or higher natural acid. And this is very important, especially when farming grapes in very hot regions, for the reasons we discussed earlier in our discussion about maximum benefit windows. Now, there is so much more that we could say about Lourens van Rensburg and Arendsig and his incredible range of single vineyard wines, but there's just no time. Now, when we finally get into the glass and give this guy a sniff, well, there really is this abundance of clean, clear blackcurrant fruit, so articulate. And then over and above that, there is again crisp, beautifully articulated red cherry fruit as well. But it goes a little bit deeper because there are puffs of fresh sweet tobacco, as well as just an ever so subtle green tinge of fennel and fresh thyme, offset by a really delightful deep note of red roses. Now, this is kind of cute because Robertson is actually known as the Valley of Roses, and I am in no way saying that the roses in the valley affect the aromas in the wine. They do not. When we get to give this guy a sip, well, it's here that all my jabbering about maximum benefit windows and Cabernet shows its merit, because you will immediately taste that the style of the wine is much lighter than your average New World Cabernet, and the fruit range almost feels slightly old world in that it's a lot redder in nature. One might even say there's a sense of slightly earlier harvest to the entire wine, and yet there is no hint of unpleasant greenness or rawness or roughness. And this is nigh on impossible to do with Cabernet Sauvignon, not least of all in a warm climate like Robertson. Because as we said earlier, if you harvest Cabernet too early, it leans heavily towards this overly green herbal, capsicum, green pepper, methoxypyrazine, unpleasant leafy herbalness. And if you harvest it too late, then it leans toward being flabby and bolshy and kind of hot, high alcohols and generally quite low acid. So threading that needle is really difficult indeed. And to do so with a resultant wine of 13% alcohol is really quite a feat. As we mentioned on the nose, clarity is key, and on the palate it is the same. The red cherry fruit is so pristine, you almost feel like you're chewing on the cherry skins. And even the deeper, riper, sweeter blackcurrant elements kind of have a wild, brambly vibrancy to them. The 13% alcohol, the wine almost seems to tiptoe, but it does not miss a single element that is required to make a great Cabernet. You've got aromatic complexity that has things like tobacco and a touch of fruit and a touch of fennel and sage, which is all really mesmerizing. And then on the palate, you have structure. You have some really beautiful articulate tannins which wrap around really articulate fruit, but it still manages to be somehow far more weightless than your average 15% hot climate Cabernet. And to add all of this, it's produced in a crazy arid continental climate like Robertson. A fascinating wine to behold, and if you haven't explored his range, you need to do so with diligence, and hopefully we're going to help you do that at Hand Drink Solo by exploring more of his wines in the future. So that's all we have time for today, but if you enjoyed this, then support us on Patreon to help us make more of these videos, and subscribe to the YouTube channel where we publish at least 6 videos each month that talk about unusual cultivars, fascinating regions like Robertson, dynamic winemakers like Lourens van Rensburg, and some of the really history-making wines that are coming out of the dynamic South African wine pits.